So Calgary Connect and Dark Skies, what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to go over what is Calgary Connect, talk a little bit about results from 5 years of monitoring, what's next, and Dark Sky Sanctuary designation with the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. I would like to take a second and acknowledge that Calgary Connect is a partner project between the Mistaki Institute, the Weaselhead Glenmore Park Preservation Society, Friends of Fish Creek Provincial Park Society, Alberta Parks, and the City of Calgary. And we are very excited to be partnering with the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada for our Dark Sky Sanctuary project. And Calgary Connect is very generously funded by the Calgary Foundation and TD Friends of the Environment Foundation. So for those who are not familiar with the Weaselhead, if you're not from Calgary, you may not have ever been here, but we are just here on the west side of the city. I don't know if you can see my mouse highlighting it here, but we are on the west side of the city, right west of the Glenmore Reservoir, and we border on the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and we're surrounded by residential development on the north and on the south. And we are a pretty awesome place to come. Not only are we one of the most biodiverse regions in the city that we're going to talk about in a minute, but we also have awesome projects going on. We have our invasive plant management, we have guided hikes, we have education programs, and we have a whole lot of wildlife that we share this space with. And so it's one of my favorite places in the city, and I'm so excited that I get to work there on a regular basis. So let's get down to the meat of it. What is Calgary Connect? Well, Calgary Connect is a long-term wildlife monitoring project in the city of Calgary and the surrounding area using remote cameras. It started in 2017 with the idea when the ring road was being planned, somebody in the planning department said that there's no wildlife in Calgary, so we don't need to worry about mitigation for wildlife around the ring road. City of Calgary said, I'm sorry, what? What's that you say? And they set out to prove that there is, in fact, wildlife in the city. So that's kind of how this was born. And the focus is on medium to large size mammals, in part because that's what you're going to be seeing in terms of ring road mitigation that you're going to have to plan for, and in part because that's going to be the main focus of regular remote cameras as well. So it did start actually as Calgary Captured in 2017 with the goal of understanding what wildlife lives in Calgary parks and how does that wildlife navigate through the city. And in 2021, it expanded outside of the city to a degree to kind of understand those corridors moving in and out of the city. So we not only want to understand how they move within the city of Calgary, we want to know how they're connecting outside. Because the city of Calgary, though it looks like it on this map, is not an island. And we need those connections outside to allow wildlife to move around. Now you can kind of see here, there's two different graphics here. One is like a transit network that we've created that shows you kind of the way that we envision wildlife moving. So just like humans have a transit map, so do wildlife. And they're in large part going to be traveling along the river valleys, but not necessarily always. And on the other side here, you can see this cool map of the city of Calgary with some green areas and some yellow areas and these highlighted areas as well. Now, those green areas are core natural areas, and the yellow are what we would call stepping stone habitat. So it might not be where they're going to spend a lot of time, but it's providing enough habitat for wildlife to move through. And those highlighted areas, the red, the green, and the blue, are the three main corridors that we think wildlife is using to get into the city of Calgary. And that is actually the City of Calgary's ecological network. And a big achievement by the City of Calgary was including this inside of the municipal development plan. That means that wildlife now have a space at the table when they're talking about future developments in the City of Calgary. So it's a huge achievement. And in 2025, hopefully we will be seeing the new Calgary plan with a new updated ecological network that does incorporate that outside of the city connections as well. So 5 years of monitoring, I said this started in 2017. It takes a really long time to analyze all of the data, to get thousands and thousands, millions, I would say, of photos, not only just classified, but also analyzed and to look for all of these trends and understand what we're looking at. So we've got results from 2017 to 2022, and the cameras are still running right now. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned there's a lot of wildlife in Calgary parks. We've also learned that a lot of people use Calgary parks with their dogs. We've also learned that wildlife shift their activity to avoid interacting with humans. Species navigate the urban landscape differently altogether than they would outside of the city. And connections leading in and out of the city are important for wildlife movement and coexistence. So let's look a little bit closer at some of that. So who's in Calgary parks? This probably actually will not come as too much of a surprise, but roughly 80% of the images from 5 years of data were humans, humans and their dogs or humans on their own. And those dogs could have been on leash or off leash. We'll get to that in a second. Roughly almost 15% were ungulates, so white-tailed deer, mule deer, moose, and one magical little elk. Actually, two elk, one of which was in the Weaselhead, which is really exciting. And then almost 5.5% carnivores. So that's all these other little critters on here. Our red fox, our raccoons, our bobcats, our coyotes, our cougars, our skunks, black bears, one magical little badger as well. But we kind of missed out on something because graphics can only be so big, and sometimes there's detections on there that are not a lot, but they still matter. And in the Weaselhead, there's a couple of critters that definitely matter. So rodents overall, rodents and lagomorphs, so hares and rabbits, didn't account for a ton of the data, but they do still are included in there in like a tiny sliver that didn't quite make it onto that big pie chart. So beavers and porcupines both occur in the Weaselhead, as do snowshoe hares on the west side and our white-tailed prairie hares on the east side, more around the reservoir. So let's talk about those dogs in parks. This is one of the biggest findings that we've had, and the one that has the biggest implications for management within the city, I would say. So in this map, you can see there's those green areas. So those, again, are those core park areas. And then there's red, and that is our off-leash dog parks. There are over 150 designated off-leash areas inside of the city of Calgary. That's pretty phenomenal. If you are a dog owner, there are lots of places to go that you can take your dog to run around off-leash. However, we have found that a lot of people prefer to use natural areas to take their dogs off leash. So you can see the larger the bubble, the more dogs that were detected off leash in these areas. There's kind of a big area down in the south at the end of Fish Creek Park, going right under Deerfoot Trail. There's a big area in Nose Hill. Now, of course, Nose Hill does have an off-leash dog park, but you can see that these dots are going far outside of there. And for our purposes, over here on the west side, we've got some rather large bubbles in the Weaselhead. So 72% of dogs off leash were in on leash areas. And so that's basically 72% of the images that we had of dogs were off leash dogs because we had very few cameras that were actually in an on leash area. Most of them, or off leash area, pardon me. Most of them were in on leash areas within these parks. And in Weaselhead, there is no off-leash area. There is, in fact, no dogs allowed off the paved trail. And none of these cameras are placed on main paved trails. So everywhere on that image where there was an off-leash dog, that is not a paved trail. So people are intentionally going out there to take their dogs off leash. And part of that is because maybe they have a dog that doesn't get along with other animals and they don't want to run the risk of having interactions at an off-leash park. And part of that is because people think that it's okay to take your dog off leash when you're in the forest because you can't see any wildlife there, right? You're not bugging anything. But that is simply not the case. So we now know, we've known this for a while, but now we've got this data to back it up, that wildlife varies how they use the urban landscape. So we can categorize them in three different ways. We have avoiders. So these are ones that will stick to natural areas. They will come into the city, but they're tending to stick to the edges. So they will come into the Weaselhead and Fish Creek and Griffith Woods and even up in Haskayne, but they're probably not going to make it all the way into Inglewood or anything like that. We have utilizers who are more urban but still prefer to stick to natural areas. So they're using natural areas by and large. They might wander into a neighborhood adjacent to a natural area, but they're for the most part sticking to there. And they might be more into the city, so they might make it to Inglewood if they're following that network. And then we have the dwellers. So they're capable of fully integrating into the urban landscape, including breeding. That's one of the big caveats is can they breed in this urban landscape? That will make them a dweller. So of course we can see our skunks. Everybody knows skunks love going under people's decks. Coyotes are known to den under people's steps as well. And bobcats more and more are being seen in the urban landscape. Things like moose, they're on a bit of a gradient. Sometimes they're in neighborhoods, but they're also kind of an avoider. They're kind of spanning quite a great area there. Cougars, you can see, are for the most part avoiders. They will again come into those edge areas, but they are not venturing far into the city. Interestingly, we found red fox falls into this category in Calgary as well. And we've posted this on some social media posts, and people are like, red foxes are everywhere. Not in Calgary. We are not finding that. So that's kind of an interesting reason why it's always good to look at wildlife in different areas as well, because you have different compositions and different interactions, and we find different things than other municipalities. And we know that all of this wildlife, whether they are a utilizer, an avoider, or a dweller, they're affected by people. And the biggest thing that we found, even for those fantastically adapted species like the coyotes and the bobcats and the deer, they're changing how and when they use the landscape based on people and their pets. And they're doing this in a couple of different ways. One is spatially, so they're not using the areas where people tend to be. So if you are taking your dog off leash in a place and you're like, I don't see wildlife there, so no problem. That's because the wildlife is actively avoiding that area to avoid people and their dogs, or just people in general. Or they will temporally separate themselves on two different scales. So they'll do it on a daily scale, shifting from more activity during the day to more activity at night, or they can also be over days and weeks. So that means that they use an area, people come by, and that might be a week or even 2 weeks before they'll use that area again. So they're being excluded from this habitat. And a recent study in Banff and Jasper found that wolves and grizzly bears are the same in those parks. And they're actually creating 500-meter buffers around these high human use trails. So animals in the city can't make 500-meter buffers to avoid people, but they're going to be on a much smaller scale, making those buffers and avoiding interacting with people wherever they can. So on those daily changes in activity, this is kind of a fun little graphic of those same three species that were on the previous slide. So you'll see coyotes, red foxes, and bobcats. And the dashed line is human activity. So you can see we tend to be active like anywhere from about 6 in the morning all the way until a little bit later, depends if it's summer, 10 o'clock-ish. And then you can see the straight lines, not straight lines, non-dashed lines are the animal. So coyotes are going to be kind of not super variable in their time when they're active, but you can see that shaded area is the overlap between people and the wildlife. And no matter what, whether it's a coyote, a bobcat, or a red fox, you are seeing a drop in activity of that wildlife when those humans are more in the area. And the coyotes, again, they're fairly well adapted to human areas. They're good at avoiding us. They're good at getting off the trail and coming back on after we're gone, but they're still avoiding interacting with us wherever they can. Bobcats, you can see, are kind of interesting because we do have them in our natural areas and we do have them in our neighborhoods. And we tend to find in our neighborhoods, they're just out all the time, whenever they want to be. But in our natural areas, they are actively avoiding being out at the same time as people. So you can see that big dip from about 12 o'clock all the way until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They don't want to be on the trails. And red fox here, again, is kind of the most drastic. They are very much avoiding when people are there. So you can see that peak around 6 a.m. and then you can see that peak right after humans disappear off the trails. So we are actively changing the way that they navigate the landscape. And that's a coexistence strategy for the wildlife. So what does that mean for them? Well, it means that to meet their needs, such as eating and finding mates, they need that time to move around. And where there's more people, as we saw in that last slide, they're shifting their time to the night. The night is their time to shine. And yes, I did think I was funny by showing eye shine on these pictures. So in the Weaselhead, we can tell that darkness is very important for a lot of wildlife because we have on that graphic where you saw all those urban avoiders, every single one of them has been found in the Weaselhead. So elk, we found one lone male elk. He was in the park for a few days. People did see him, but he was actively avoiding and using the park at night. We did also catch him crossing under Stony Trail using wildlife mitigation that's there, so that was really exciting. Black bears also using the park mostly at night. Red foxes at night, cougars at night, and moose. You will see them occasionally during the day, but by and large, they're making most of their movements at night. And all of these guys, these are all images from the Weaselhead. So what about those corridors in and out of the city? So that's again, that red area is the Haskayne-Beaumont Trail, as we call it. The green one is the Griffith Woods Weaselhead corridor, and that one below in blue is the Fish Creek corridor. And these are the major corridors that you're going to see going through for wildlife to move in and out of the city. And you'll notice that Weaselhead and Fish Creek both have a barrier. in the new ring road. So the new ring road has created a bit of a cutoff on there. And so, in order to support wildlife movement, Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors did build some mitigation underneath. So, they built it wide enough for wildlife to move under. And it's actually in large part due to the Weaselhead, Glenmore Park Preservation Society, that there was this widening at the underpass in Weaselhead. Initially, they were going to make it fairly small, but the group said wildlife can't use that. And so it was actually made wider specifically to accommodate wildlife movement. And so this is pretty amazing. And we can see that wildlife are using it. They're connecting through there to Satina and then on through Griffith Woods and out that way, out to the west. And this is including species like moose. The first time I checked those cameras underneath the bridge, moose. There was moose. And I was like, this is amazing. They're using it. Since then, we've also had black bears and cougars using the underpass. There has been one red fox. We have not actually caught a bobcat on camera, but I suspect they are there. And we've had a skunk, which is pretty exciting, and then your usual suspects in your deer and your coyotes. And this past month, there was quite a lot of deer and coyote activity going underneath the road. And you can imagine if they're not using that area, there's one of two things that happens. They're using the road itself to get over, and we're risking wildlife vehicle collisions, or they're just avoiding it altogether, and you have a complete fragmentation of that available habitat for all of this wildlife. So this is really important, and it's really exciting to see that wildlife is in fact moving using this area.